A hangar in northern New Jersey. A 1965 Cessna 320. Sky Night sitting on jacks, silver and white, engine cowlings open. The sellers, A&P, had signed the annual 3 months earlier. The pre-buy cost $2,500. The aircraft flew clean on the demo flight. The logbooks looked right. 6 months later, the new owner sat across from his mechanic with a bill he had not planned for: $18,000. That was the first annual. Not because the aircraft was a fraud. Because the pre-buy did what it was designed to do, and what it was designed to do was never designed to protect you. I have been the mechanic on the other side of that table, and I have delivered that conversation more than once. The pilots who received it were not careless. They were not naive. They paid for an inspection. They flew the demo. They read the logbooks. They did not know what the inspection was not required to find. There are 10 of those things. If you are about to buy an aircraft, this is the briefing the seller was counting on you not getting. If you already own one, watch this anyway. This is also a checklist for what your last inspection may have missed. Number 3 is the one your inspector almost certainly skipped. Not because he was incompetent, because the standard pre-buy in this country has never required it. If you want aviation content the industry does not produce, subscribe to Sky Ranch. And drop in the comments, have you ever had a first annual comeback with a surprise bill? Tell me what it was. The logbook is the aircraft's biography. Every flight hour, every squawk, every airworthiness directive sign-off, every annual inspection, in theory, all of it is there. That theory assumes nobody managed the book before you opened it. A logbook that has been managed does not look forged. It looks clean. Uniform handwriting across multiple years is the first fingerprint. A 3-year stretch where total hours advance by exactly the amount the seller claims, with no corresponding maintenance entries, is the second. Logbook falsification. In general aviation is a documented criminal pattern. A Virginia pilot who instructed his director of maintenance to backfill annual inspection entries after a sale received a 30-day jail sentence and 12 months of supervised release. James Randall Jennings of Goodlettsville, Tennessee, received 37 months in federal prison for falsifying helicopter logbooks and transmitting false documents to a buyer electronically. These are not edge cases. These are the cases that reached a prosecutor. What you can do before any A&P arrives: lay every logbook in chronological order and calculate total hours forward from each entry yourself. Count annual sign-offs. There should be at least one per calendar year, as a minimum, for any airworthy aircraft. Confirm that each annual entry carries a valid A&P certificate number and an IA designation. Cross-reference any entry that mentions a ground incident, sudden stoppage, or prop contact against what follows, which must document mandatory teardown compliance. If a prop strike entry exists and no teardown record follows, the logbook has told you something the seller did not intend. The logbook does not lie. The owner might. Every United States registered aircraft has a public government file. It takes 5 minutes to open it, and it costs nothing. The NTSB Aviation Accident Database is searchable by N-number at no cost. It contains every reportable accident and incident from 1982 forward. Sellers are not legally required to disclose accident history in most states. The logbook entry may read minor ground incident, aircraft returned to service. The NTSB report for that same event may read propeller strike, engine teardown required, crankshaft inspected. The gap between those two descriptions is measured in dollars. Most buyers never run this check. Neither does the A&P mechanic they pay to protect them, because running it appears in no standard pre-buy scope in general aviation. The address is ntsb.gov. The N-number goes in the search field. The database returns every reportable event tied to that registration, including the prop strikes the current owner described as minor and the incidents that received 3 logbook lines and no teardown entry. Before you schedule the A&P mechanic, before you book the flight to look at the aircraft, run the N-number. 5 minutes, $0. The check costs nothing. The miss costs everything. The listing says low time engine, fresh major overhaul 400 hours ago. Plenty of service life ahead. That number is correct, and it tells you almost nothing about the magnetos. Magneto manufacturers require overhaul based on calendar time, not hours flown. Bendix Service Bulletin SB643C specifies either a 5-year or 12-year overhaul interval depending on serial number and model. Slick and Power Up carry 12-year requirements in their service documentation. A low-time engine overhauled 11 years ago has magnetos sitting 11 years into their calendar clock, regardless of how few hours the tachometer shows. The buyer who reads only the hour total discovers this at the first annual or at the first ignition event at altitude over terrain that does not accommodate an off-airport landing. A Bendix War AN inspect and repair as necessary runs $500 to $700 per magneto. 2 magnetos is $1,000 to $1,400. These are predictable numbers when someone checks the date before the purchase agreement is signed. To verify before any mechanic arrives, pull the magneto type number and serial number from the engine logbook. Contact the manufacturer. Ask for the applicable calendar overhaul interval. Compare that interval to the date of the last documented overhaul. Low hours does not mean current. Check the date. Cessna and Piper chose bladder tank construction for their early singles and light twins deliberately. A rubber fuel cell inside the wing cavity keeps fuel contained in a survivable accident. That was the engineering rationale. Crash fire protection built into the fuel system at the factory. There are no FAA mandatory inspection requirements for fuel bladders. None. The bladder deteriorates behind closed access panels, invisible to every annual and every pre-buy, aging on its own schedule with no regulatory requirement that anyone open the panel and look at it. A stiffened, cracked bladder collapses inward as fuel is consumed, blocking fuel flow and starving the engine at cruise. It also eliminates the crash fire protection the design was built around. The safety feature Cessna engineered into the airframe now works against the occupant. Bladder replacement on a Cessna. 182 runs $1,820 to $2,820 per tank. A new cell carries a 7-year warranty. An original bladder on a 1978 aircraft carries no warranty and no documented inspection history because the FAA requires neither. Before the pre-buy agreement is signed, ask for access panel removal and physical bladder inspection by name. Ask, when was the last bladder replacement documented in the airframe logbook? If no entry exists, assume the original equipment is still installed. No inspection required. That is the problem. Everything covered so far lives on paper or in a calendar. The next 3 items pass the paperwork. They pass the annual, they pass the compression check and the visual inspection and the free movement verification. Each one has a direct path from the missed check to a pilot who did not land. The pre-buy paperwork confirms it in writing. Opened panels, inspected cable connections, verified free movement of all flight controls. A professional performed that inspection. The entry is in the logbook. Control cables fail from the inside out. External visual inspection and free movement checks detect nothing about internal strand corrosion or fatigue. A cable that moves freely, passes the visual, and catches no snag from a rag drawn along its exterior can have failed internal strands behind the surface. The inspector touched. The definitive inspection method requires removing the cable from the aircraft, relieving all tension, and physically reverse twisting it under magnification. This is not done at annuals. No minimum scope pre-buy requires it. It demands labor, tooling, and full rigging to accomplish, and the pre-buy the seller agreed to fund will not include it unless the buyer writes it in by name. In 2025, General Aviation News documented a fatal accident. A CFI and a student. The cause was a corroded aileron cable. The pre-buy paperwork confirmed panels had been opened and free movement had been verified. The internal corrosion and the stuck pulleys were missed at the pre-buy and at every subsequent annual inspection. The documentation showed compliance, the cable showed failure. AOPA recommends cable replacement every 15 years. Most 50-year-old general aviation aircraft carry no documented cable replacement in any logbook ever produced for them. Internal strands fail silently. The annual was signed 60 days ago by a licensed airframe and power plant mechanic with inspection authorization. The aircraft is current. The buyer takes possession, knowing a professional confirmed it. What the annual confirms is minimum airworthiness on the day the form was signed, against the airworthiness directives the mechanic checked, against the serial number ranges the mechanic queried. Airworthiness directives apply to specific serial number ranges. An airworthiness directive on an installed magneto, alternator, or fuel pump applies to this specific airframe and appears in neither the airframe nor the engine logbook, because the mechanic who signed the annual searched by aircraft model, not by every installed appliance. The buyer who takes possession owns the violation. Under 14 CFR 91.403, the owner and operator bears direct responsibility for airworthiness directive compliance. Flying with outstanding airworthiness. Directives draws FAA fines up to $27,000 per day. Insurance may be voided. Personal liability. Following an accident carries no ceiling. Aviation. Consumer documented a specific case. A light twin snagged in a pre-purchase inspection for an unsigned airworthiness directive. The seller's maintenance shop had not confirmed teardown compliance. The airworthiness directive had been open for years. Nobody had run the appliance airworthiness directive list independently. An independent airworthiness directive search costs $50 to $200 through a professional search service. The FAA database at argyle.faa.gov is free. Search separately the airframe, the engine, the propeller, and every installed appliance. The FAA does not care who signed the logbook before you. Cabin heat in most light general aviation aircraft runs through a shroud wrapped around the muffler. The system is familiar, simple, and in use on nearly every flight below 10,000 feet. The heater circuit and the exhaust circuit share a wall. When the muffler cracks, carbon monoxide enters the cabin through the same pathway that supplies heat. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. At 10 to 20% blood saturation, it produces confusion and impaired judgment. The pilot does not recognize as a physiological event. The aircraft continues flying until it does not. The NTSB identified 31 general aviation accidents attributed to carbon monoxide poisoning between 1982 and 2020. 23 were fatal. 42 people died. A carbon monoxide detector was present in exactly one of the 31 aircraft. An FAA analysis found a strong relationship between muffler age and failure in carbon monoxide accidents. Mufflers in the majority of those accidents had accumulated more than 1,000 hours of use. The NTSB recommended mandatory carbon monoxide detectors in general aviation aircraft in 2004. The FAA declined. The NTSB recommended it again in January 2022. The FAA declined a second time. The diagnostic that a pre-buy must include is soot staining inside the muffler shroud. That staining is the visible signature of a carbon monoxide pathway into the cabin air supply. The cowl must come off. The shroud surfaces must be physically examined. This is not a standard pre-buy step. 42 deaths, 2 NTSB recommendations, 2 declinations from the FAA. Which surprises you more, the number or the refusals? Drop it in the comments. 3 physical checks that pass every standard inspection. A fatality on one, 42 deaths on another, federal exposure on the third. What follows is different. These are not checks the system forgot to require. These are the gaps the system built and has not closed across 60 years of certificated general aviation. The mechanic looks up from the compression gauge. 76/80, 78/80, 75/80. all within normal limits. The engine has 1,100 hours since major overhaul, flown lightly this past year, maybe 40 hours total, hangared, protected. The compression test measures ring seal against the cylinder walls. That is all it measures. The camshaft in a stored piston engine is the first surface to go dry. The cam sits above the oil line at rest. When the engine goes weeks without turning, the hardened lobe surface loses its oil film, and corrosion pits develop on the contact surface that drives every cylinder in the engine. Those pits deepen between flights. The compression test reads normal the entire time, because ring seal and cam condition require different instruments to assess. The cam does not announce its failure. The cylinder goes flat at altitude. A borescope is a fiber optic camera inserted through the spark plug hole. It sees the cam lobe directly, it sees the cylinder wall condition, the valve faces, and the seating surfaces the compression gauge cannot reach. A full borescope across every cylinder takes 20 minutes and adds $200 to $400 to a pre-buy inspection. No standard pre-buy inspection in general aviation requires one. The mechanic runs what the pre-buy agreement specifies. The seller's agreed scope does not include a borescope because no standard pre-buy in this country has ever required one, and because the cost of a failed cam falls on the buyer after the aircraft changes hands. Camshaft replacement in a Lycoming costs $1,500 for the part. Accessing it after the fact, splitting the case, and inspecting what the teardown reveals can cost $25,000 to $40,000 depending on the model. Before signing the pre-buy agreement, write this in by name. Borescope inspection of all cylinders required, including visual inspection of cam lobe condition through the exhaust valve side. Ask for the aircraft's annual flight totals for the last 3 years, and calculate the inactive periods from the logbook yourself before the A&P mechanic arrives. The compression test is not the cam check. The engine log looks clean. 800 hours since major overhaul. Compressions verified normal. Oil filter cut, no metal particles. Annual signed by a licensed A&P IA. This engine has been maintained. 3 years back, there is a 3-line entry. Ground incident during taxi. Minor prop contact. Aircraft returned to service. No teardown entry follows. A Lycoming engine that contacts the ground, any contact including a deceleration event without visible prop damage, triggers mandatory teardown inspection under FAA Airworthiness Directive 91-1-Form-22 and Lycoming Service Bulletin 533C. The mechanism at risk is the crankshaft gear and the dowel that locks it to the crank. A sudden deceleration event overstresses that dowel without bending the shaft. The crankshaft runout check, the verification most buyers accept as proof of compliance, does not inspect the gear train. It confirms only that the shaft is straight. Lycoming's own product support documentation states this directly. Any decision to operate the engine without disassembly and inspection violates Airworthiness Directive 91-1-Form-22 and Lycoming Service Bulletin 533C, both mandatory. When the dowel shears, all engine power is lost. The crank was straight. The gear train had been compromised since the day of the ground incident. Continental Service Bulletin 96-11B carries the same teardown recommendation for Continental-powered aircraft without the Airworthiness Directive enforcement mechanism, making prop strike documentation harder to verify from logbooks on Continental engines. A full engine overhaul, if the gear train fails after purchase inspection, costs $25,000 to $60,000 depending on model. The crank can be straight. The gear train fails anyway. The Cessna 210 has served owners for 6 decades. High performance, retractable gear, pressurized in the later variants. The annual was recent. The interior is clean. The carry-through spar runs invisibly overhead, wrapped in upholstery, behind a cushion pad Cessna bonded to it at the factory using moisture-attracting adhesive. The carry-through spar is the single structural member connecting both wing panels through the fuselage. Cessna bonded an interior cushion pad directly to the carry-through spar lower cap using hydroscopic glue that attracts and holds moisture against the aluminum forging. The pad covered the spar surface from every annual inspection and every pre-buy in the aircraft's history because no regulation required anyone to look behind it. Moisture sits against the aluminum. The aluminum corrodes. The corrosion creates a stress concentration. Under repeated flight loads, a fatigue crack initiates at the corrosion pit and propagates inward, invisible through the upholstery, invisible through existing access panels, progressing through every annual and every pre-buy until the spar can no longer carry the wing. May 26, 2019. A Cessna T210M over Queensland, Australia, suffered in-flight structural breakup. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau and NTSB traced the cause to fatigue cracking at a corrosion pit in the carry-through spar lower cap, inboard of the wing attachment lugs. FAA Airworthiness Directive 2023-02-17, effective. March 20, 2023, mandates visual and eddy current inspection of the carry-through spar lower cap on the Cessna 210N, 210R, P, 210N, 210R, T, 210NT, 210R, 177, 177A, 177B, 177R, G and F, 177R, G. As of January 2023, the FAA had received 211 inspection reports on 177 series aircraft. 120 reported corrosion. 14 spars were removed from service. Textron Aviation is still developing a replacement spar for out-of-production 177 models. If you own one of these aircraft, what I just described may not have been run at any inspection in its history. The Airworthiness Directive is active. The spar is behind the upholstery. If eddy current inspection reveals cracking, spar replacement runs $43,600, the FAA's own estimate from the 2020 Airworthiness Directive. A machined replacement spar for the 210 was quoted at $20,000 for the part alone in 2022. An inspection without findings costs $3,108 to $3,788. Visual inspection through existing access panels is insufficient. The FAA requires eddy current specifically because subsurface cracking is invisible. Most pre-buy inspections on Cessna 210 and 177 aircraft today do not include it. The corrosion was behind the upholstery. It always was. 10 items. From logbook authenticity to the aluminum behind the cabin cushion, everyone absent from the standard pre-buy scope, FAA mandates an annual and has never mandated what a buyer deserves to know before signing. The system protects the seller's mechanic, who ran what the agreement required. It does not protect the buyer who signed it without knowing what to write in. Whether your aircraft has cleared these checks is a question for your logbook and your mechanic's bench. Subscribe to Sky Ranch for aviation content that does not clean up the answer. Did your pre-buy include a borescope, or did you get the compression test and call it done? Tell me in the comments.